Our next panelist will be Dr. John Lattimer.
Well, Mark, Dr. Lundberg, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here because I'm a Middle Westerner. How many here in the audience are Middle Westerners? Great. You people understand what I'm going to talk about. You've all been hunters to some extent. I was a hunter. I was a rifleman. I did research, ballistic research for the Army in World War II, and then I took care of a lot of patients who were wounded or killed by the same type of bullet that killed President Kennedy. That was a World War II bullet. I'm an experimenter, and I urge you all, as you think about what went on and the questions come up in your mind, to consider some experiments of your own. That's the only way you're going to know what the truth is, because of the multiplicity of conflicting data that you get with great vigor and great skill from the media and from our fellow investigators. Well, I, as a matter of fact, approached the Warren Commission report as a skeptic. And the reason, John, can you put on the first slide? The reason was that the illustrations in the Warren, no, go back one, please. Yeah, the illustrations of President Kennedy's wounds were obviously not right, and this worried me. I knew President Kennedy, and this is not President Kennedy. President Kennedy had a big hump on the back of his neck from all the steroids he was taking. And the point of entry, for example, of the bullet isn't down there. It's way up here at the level of the base of his chin. And furthermore, the course of the bullet, as depicted through his neck, was not downward at 15 or 20 degrees, as would have been expected from the 6th floor of the repository building. So I decided that obviously this was wrong. The artist had not done a good job, so I went down to see him. And I said, "Did you see the body?" "Well, no." "Did you see photographs of the body?" "Well, no." This illustration was all made from hearsay, and well, this at least accounted for the discrepancy between this and what I'd expected. And so the next thing, then many of the people here began to raise such tremendous hullabaloo about objections, one thing or another, that you had no way to know what the truth was. And as I say, you have to do some investigation, experimentation for your own, on your own. Well, I went down to Dallas as a visiting professor, and while I was there, naturally, I went over to the building. And the next slide, John. And you're all familiar with this one, but looking at it, I realized that Oswald had learned his lessons as a Marine rifleman very well. He adopted absolutely the optimum position. He got around as far as he could behind the course of the car, and he fired down the length of the travel of the victim. This is what we call enfilading fire, and he had to get up quite high because he had to clear this tree. And the tree that's right under the window, it's a live oak tree and it's been trimmed. The branches are quite sturdy right out to the tips, and it interfered. You didn't see that. You saw the car through the branches of the tree when it was right under the window, and then finally it came out from under it. And the last place that a good rifleman would pick would be over here on the grassy knoll, firing at a target going across your field of fire with trees in the way and people in the way on the sidewalk and various unpredictable things. Well, I say again, looking at the ground, it made it obvious that he was very skillful at this. And the next slide, going up into the window where he fired from, there was a surprise to me. These are the boxes on which he rested the gun, and another box on which he sat, and the open window. And the big surprise to me was that this windowsill is very low. It's right down on the floor. And you're looking right down into the automobiles that are going by underneath. To be sure, you see them through the branches of the tree. But it is so tempting. Now, all of you that have been brush hunters know that as your target goes behind the brush or trees and very close, you're tempted to fire at it because it's so close.
John, I wonder if that could be focused better from here, at least to see how to focus. Is it in focus to you? That's better.
No, it's not yet.
Well, can you turn the lights down more? Turn the lights out more. How about turning these front lights off? Yeah, that
That's
better?
exactly the opposite. If I turn off the front lights and leave on them, there you go. No, they don't like that either.
Worse. Make it dark.
Turn them all off?
Well, in any case, with this low windowsill, as I say, the whole scene was much more understandable. It was much easier to see that what he did. He couldn't resist, even though the car was obscured by the branches of the tree. Your eye synthesizes glimpses of the target as it goes behind the brush, and he couldn't resist shooting at it. And somewhere around frame 160, he took a shot at it and hit a twig, as I see it, and missed the car completely. It deflected his bullet. And you can tell it's 160 because a lot of people in the Zapruder movie turn around and look back at the window, including Governor Connolly. And the next slide. The next thing that occurred was everybody was saying, well, the gun's no good, the ammunition's no good, the distance is too far, the time was too short. These are things that you can investigate yourself. I went down to DeVega's in New York and I said, you have these guns for sale? And they said, yep, how many do you want? And I said, how much are they? $6. Shopping is better in New York, I must tell you. And in any case, I took 4, and with serial numbers fairly close to Oswald's. And then I found out where the Japanese telescopes came from, and I got 4 telescopes exactly like Oswald's. I mounted them on the gun exactly like Oswald's were done. You know, there were 4 holes, but he only used part of them, or the Kleins only used part of them. And then Leon Day, is Leon here? Leon Day and I figured out what this strap was, out of which he made a sling that nobody had figured out up to then, and made very satisfactory simulations of the gun to use in our experiments. And the next slide. Next problem came about the ammunition. Out in Kansas, there was a pathologist, John Nichols, as some of you knew, the other person that was willing to do some experimentation, and I went out to visit him at his invitation, and I said, well, you got the wrong gun. And I got him the right gun, but he had the right ammunition. I said, where'd you get that? He said, down at the corner gun shop. So I said, put your coat on. We'll go down and see if he has more. And he did. And he told me that if I advertised in the Shotgun News all over the Middle West, they'd dump the ammunition. And altogether, I acquired about 1,000 rounds of this very good, very dependable American Western Cartridge Company ammunition. And it came in 4 lots, and we had samples of all 4 lots, 6,000, 6,001, etc. And one of my children, John, weighed every cartridge to be sure there were no discrepancies or great variations in the loading or the powder charge or whatever. And they were very consistent. And we never had a misfire in all of our experiments. This is very dependable ammunition. It has other characteristics we'll talk about in a minute. And the next slide. Now, what about the gun itself? Well, I'm no marksman, but this is not marksmanship. This is shooting fish in a barrel. It's so easy. If you let me put my feet flat on the floor and rest my elbows on my knees, and boxes range exactly where I want to put them, and a sling and a telescope, I can put 3 bullets in Kennedy's head every time. And as I say, nothing difficult about it. And it's like, well, as all of you know, all of you hunters know, all of you that are in the military, if you rest your gun against a tree or on the edge of your foxhole, you're deadly. I mean, this is not marksmanship. This is almost like bench rest shooting. It's very easy, in contrast to what everybody said about it being difficult. And the next slide, what will the gun do? This is a group of 3 shots at the maximum distance of the 3 at Dallas, and as you see, we've got a group the size of about $50. Now, this is not wonderful, but it's perfectly adequate to do what was done at Dallas. And the next slide, a good telescope and a good gun, you put the bullets through the same hole every time. On my good rifles and good telescopes, I can put a bullet in your right eye or your left eye, no problem at all. And this is the kind of telescope that the mafia brags about supplying their killers. And you know perfectly well that no big organization was behind Oswald, such as the Mafia or the CIA, the KGB. None of them would have sent him out with a $12 gun. That was his own $12. And the next slide. Well, this is my then 14-year-old son, Gary, now a professor in the medical school, but no problem at all in putting 3 bullets in Kennedy's head very easily. And the next slide. Well, what about Oswald? Here is Oswald's rifle scorebook from the Marine Corps, and this is at 200 yards, which is more than twice the distance at Dallas. And it's a rapid fire, sitting position, at a profile is strikingly like Kennedy's head and shoulders sticking up above the rear seat of the car. What does he do? 48 out of a possible 50. Well, you see, that's one day. What about another day? The next slide. 49 out of a possible 50. So he was no expert, but he was perfectly competent to do what was done at Dallas. I have his rifle scorebook. I brought it even to the meeting. You can look at it if you want it later. And the next slide. Well, I got, by virtue of having done some experiments, I applied and got permission to look at the restricted Kennedy autopsy material. And when I did, there was no great mystery. The hump on the back of his neck brought the point of impact of the bullet up to a level of his chin, and the downward course of the bullet coming out low on his neck, where Dr. Perry did the tracheostomy. We all commented there was a pretty low tracheostomy. Well, the reason was he did it right through the bullet holes, or the wound of exit. And then it went out at his collar band and then made a nick in his necktie with a little blood stain on it. So you knew perfectly well that well, let's go back one. Go back, John. No, let's go the other way. Yeah, and in the neck, there were some little tiny calcified fragments that were not bone fragments from a direct strike on the bone, but maybe pulled away as it went through the tendons and muscles next to the transverse process of the lower cervical vertebrae. And then it went on, when you fire a shot into soft tissues, you get a bubble, the cavity that forms in these tissues, and this becomes hemorrhagic, but then it closes up. And that hemorrhagic staining was found on the top of the lung and on the top of the pleura, even though it didn't go through the lung or through the pleura. It then went through his windpipe. It let air, you can see streaks of air coming out of the windpipe into this closed space of the body called the mediastinum. And that can be a fatal infection because the air in your trachea is contaminated. And the fact that he'd had a strike on his spine would have rendered him quadriplegic. So a quadriplegic, troubles that brings you, an infection in this closed space of the body, and when you're taking a lot of cortisone, your resistance to infections is way down. And for that reason alone, this might very well have been a fatal wound, but it isn't all that entered into it, as I'll show you. There are other structures in this area that we'll speak about more that would have rendered this a fatal wound. And the next slide. Now, here is the necktie knot spot in Kennedy's necktie and one of ours in one of our simulations. And the next slide. Now here's President Kennedy showing a little bit of the effect of the cortisone he was taking. And he went to, well, one of the good artists, the best artist in the country, a man named Draper, was commissioned to paint his portrait, and he said, "You've got 2 weeks to do it. After that, I'll look too skinny. After then, I'll look too fat. And then it'll be a couple of months before he could do it again." Because he took medicines which had this effect of replacing his adrenal tissue and giving him this slightly jowly look. Norman Rockwell could take a photograph like this and make it look like a painting. He wouldn't let a painter paint him during the time that he was looking like that. And the next slide. Here is the hump on the back of his neck, and you can see that a bullet entering here and coming out there would indeed go down at about a 15 or 20 degree angle. And the next slide. He didn't always look like that. This is the way he looked when he was on the Harvard swimming team. And without the hump, his base of his neck was way down here. And like his brother Bobby, you know, had a long, slender neck. And the next slide. Well, lest you think that these hormones don't have an effect, here is a child whose adrenals were putting out too much steroid, and he had a big hump on the back of his neck and all of this fatness of the face and extreme conditions. Well, when that occurs, you call in your friendly urologist, and he comes in and fixes the adrenal situation. And the next slide, a couple of weeks later, you begin to look better, and the next slide, 2 weeks after that, you're back to normal. And so they do have an impact, no doubt about it. And the next slide. Well, the bullet hole on the back of Kennedy's neck looked like this. This is the size of the bullet, about 1/4 inch in diameter, and you see the little black specks around the edge of it from the burning from this rapidly spinning bullet. If the body is unsupported, as in this particular body, the bullet where it goes in makes a small wound, but where it comes out it makes a great big wound. The next slide. Like that. And the next slide, on the other hand, if the bullet comes out at the edge of the collar band, like that, as in Kennedy's case, and in the case of one of our simulations where we tilted the body exactly the way Kennedy was, and the bullet came out exactly the right point, the next slide, the exit wound was tiny. And if you looked at that, you'd say, well, you know, this tiny wound, could it have been a wound of entrance? You'd say, well, maybe it was small. But the reason was that the skin was buttressed, supported by the collar of the shirt. And the next slide.
Are these actual photos?
Quiet, please.
If you now tilt your body so that the bullet comes out below the collar band 1/2 inch, then the skin does begin to burst open, and if you tilt the body still more and have it come out 1 inch away from the collar band, you get a great big wound of exit like that. So the reason for the smallness of the wound of exit was the support of the collar band. Again, you don't know this unless you try it.
John, there was a question I don't think you heard, and I think is legitimate. The issue as to which of these slides are slides of Kennedy and which of these slides are slides of your experiment with the same kind of weapon.
Yeah, well, these are all our experimental slides up to now. And the next slide. Well, here is what happened when it ticked the end of this vertebra. The bullet begins to tumble. I didn't know it was going to tumble, and I was surprised that when the bullets came out of our necks that they would always tumble. And the next slide. In this area, to go back a minute to the area of the neck that I showed you a moment ago where this bullet went through, in that area is this tangle of nerves we call the brachial plexus that supplies the right arm. And this cavity is expanded, stimulated all these nerves, and the closest nerve muscle group going down the axillary nerve is a deltoid muscle that makes your arm go up. So his elbows went up. And the second closest, or the next group goes down the musculocutaneous nerve, stimulates the biceps, and your arm does that. And the third group are the flexors of your forearm, and the hands do this. And that's exactly what he did. Then the impulse right across the midline, excuse me, to the other side, and his other arm did the same thing. Not quite as rapidly, but both arms ended up in that same position. And we've known this for years, that this happens. Now, those are not the only structures here. One of them is the vagus nerve that controls the heart rate. That would have been damaged. On each side, there is a nerve going to the diaphragm, where your breathing occurs primarily. Both of them would have been damaged, so his breathing would have been impaired. He would have been quadriplegic, his mediastinum would have been contaminated, and this would have been a fatal wound, in contrast to what we had assumed up to now. And the next slide. Here are President Kennedy's elbows up in this position that I just spoke about. Shoulders up, biceps contracted, and hands flexed and turned inward. You'll see more of that in Dr. West's movie in a few minutes. And the next slide. This position was described by Dr. Thorburn in England 100 years ago, who made a textbook out of what happened when you injured the spinal cord at different levels, and every textbook in Europe 100 years ago had this illustration from Thorburn. He said if you came into your emergency room in the morning and found somebody with his elbows in this peculiar position, you could be sure he had a wound of the lower the part of his neck to the spinal cord. And we call it Thorburns reflex, Thorburns position. And the next slide. Coming out of President Kennedy's neck, this bullet tumbled and it hit Connally going sideways. It shattered his rib, it kept on turning, hit his wrist going sideways, kept turning, came out of his wrist going backwards, and buried itself in his leg going backwards, and from that position was knocked out later. The next slide. Now, Governor Connally keeps insisting he was hit by a separate bullet. Had he been hit by a separate bullet, the bullet hole in his back would have been a small punctate wound with a black rim like that. If it was a tumbling bullet, the next slide, it would have been what we call keyholing, and you would have had an elongated hole. Well, let's look at what he had. The next slide. Here is a diagram and the operative note done by Dr. Shaw at the time, and he draws a depiction of the bullet, of the wound of entry as elongated excuse me, and 3 centimeters in length, which is exactly the length of the bullet. And down here on the wrist, he again draws a hole 3 centimeters in length where it went in, again the exact length of the bullet. And the text down below says, the interrogator said, might it have been tumbling? And he said there might have been some tumbling. And later on, he changed his story, but somewhat, but still indicated that it was elongated. It was not punctate. And the next slide. And here's the lateral view. He again drew a 3 centimeter long hole. And he did this at other occasions as well. And the next slide. And go ahead to the next one, John. John, let's have the next slide. These are 5, 6 of our models. This is the Connally target face in front of Kennedy's body. And the bullet comes out of Kennedy tumbling, and it hits the Connally target going exactly sideways, making a 3 centimeter hole in every one except this one where it didn't tumble. So as I say, till you do this for yourself, you don't know what to believe. And you've got to do it over and over. You can't just do it once. And what I show you, we did over and over and over, even though I may show you only one specimen. And the next slide. Well, here's the kind of the hole in Connally's coat, one of our Connally coats. And the next slide. And the positioning of the bodies is such that Connally said that he heard the shot. Being in the jump seat, he tried to look back over his right shoulder to see the president and had to lean way over to his left to do it, and couldn't see him. And as he was turning back, having pushed himself around with his right hand over against his left knee, with his white Stetson hat in his hand, the bullet holes all line up perfectly at frame 224. And we'll see a good deal more of that. But in any case, this business that's nonsense about a zigzag course of the bullet is sheer nonsense. This bullet is a very good bullet. You can put up 3 telephone poles, it'll go right through all 3 like nobody's business. It's a good bullet. And the zigzag course, it did not follow. And the next slide. Well, I noticed at the time that some of our bodies, if we didn't hit them exactly right, the clothing would bulge out ahead of the exiting bullet, and if you hit the tie would flop up. And I looked at the Zapruder movie for that, but if you look at it at normal speed, you don't see it. But if you slow it way down and put it 1 frame, 2nd frame, next frame, then you see it. And it was discovered by Jeff Lotz out on the West Coast, the next slide, that the lapel of Connally's coat looks all right in 223, but in 224 it suddenly bulges forward as the bullet plus a cloud of fragments of rib come out under his lapel, and his jacket lapel pops forward and then pops back. And if we have time, I hope we'll be able to show you that later on. And this establishes for the first time when both men were hit, because immediately both men react. The next slide. Okay, John. And Kennedy's elbows start up, as we saw before, in Thorburns reflex. Connally's white Stetson hat shows here in 225, bigger in 226, gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you can obviously see it's the hat. And again, Dr. West is going to show you this in very spectacular fashion. And the next slide. Well, here's one of these bullets having gone through a couple feet of very tough wood and coming out looking very good. It's a tough bullet. And the next slide. On the other hand, if it tumbles and hits something going sideways, it gets deformed. And this bullet is deformed. It is bent on its long axis, and it is flattened on the rear end. Now this is a very tough bullet, as I just showed you. You can put it on the floor, you can stamp on it, you do nothing to it. You can roll a gurney over it, you do nothing to it. You have to exert tremendous force on it to deform it to this extent. This is a deformed bullet, and to call this a pristine bullet is strictly misleading. And it is not pristine, it is deformed as by tremendous force of hitting something going sideways, and again, you don't find this out till you try it. And the next slide. Here is the bullet in question, 399, that went through the two men, a little lead sticking out the rear end. Now, one of our test bullets had been deformed by huge force, by a very powerful vise. You can see the marks of my vise. And when you squash it the same amount the 399 is squashed, you extrude the soft gray lead out the back end of the jacket like toothpaste out of a tube. And if you take your razor blade and cut that piece off, it weighs exactly 2 grains. That's the exact amount of weight that's missing from this bullet. Now, where did those pieces go? They were scraped off as the bullet went sideways and then backwards through Connolly's wrist. The next slide. And here they are. Here's Connolly's wrist with a bullet having hit it very gently, shattered it, but it didn't really tear it away, with 3 bullet fragments in it, which incidentally matched 399 on analysis. And here's one of our test wrists with 3 of our fragments. The next slide, the other fragment in his leg, our fragment, 4 fragments. And then somebody makes a careless remark that 4 fragments are too many to be accounted for by 2 grains of lead. Well, again, this is not what you find out if you really try it. If you really try it, the next slide, you can take that piece of lead and make 41 fragments out of it. So that this kind of statement that 4 fragments is too many is the kind of poor research that you've been inundated with, and I urge you to try it if you're going to talk about it. And the next slide. Well, here is John Nichols, the doctor that I spoke about, and here is a block of ponderosa pine boards 4 feet thick before that bullet stopped. As I say, if it doesn't break up and if it keeps on going, doesn't tumble, it's got tremendous penetrating capability. And people say it couldn't go through 2 men. Well, it could go through 6 men. As you know, all of you that have been in the military, you spread your troops out as you approach the enemy so that more than 1 man won't be hit by the same bullet. Military bullets are made so they'll go through people and hit more people. And the next slide. Well, another reason you know Connolly's bullet had to be slowed down by something, such as Kennedy's neck, is that when we lined up a Connolly ribs, a Connolly arms, and a Connolly leg, it shattered the rib, it shattered the arm bone, and it shattered the leg bone, the strongest bone in your body. However, the next slide, if you passed that same bullet through a Kennedy neck first and made it tumble, you shattered the rib and you shattered the arm bone, but you did not break the leg bone, and that's exactly what happened with Governor Connolly. His leg was not shattered. The bullet had been slowed down by obviously going through President Kennedy's neck. And the next slide. Well, here is poor President Kennedy still sitting upright. Connolly is now crumpled. Mrs. Connolly's pulled him over backwards out of harm's way. Mrs. Kennedy is looking over into President Kennedy's face saying, "What's the matter?" He had this peculiar expression on his face. She's trying to push his arms down, but they won't push because that's a rigid reflex, and she is within inches of being killed herself. Oswald now has had 5 full seconds to zero in on the back of his head, 3 seconds to work the action of the gun and pick up the target, and then 2 seconds to lock onto the target and make sure you hit him in the head. And he did. And again, Dr. West is going to show you that very well illustrated, the difference and the adequacy of 3 and 5 seconds. And the next slide. And here's the famous 313 with the head exploding. All of the explosion is in front of the ear, the E version of the scalp, the halo of exploded tissue, the fragments of skull, 3 of them going up in the air. Our fragments of skull went 50 feet in the air. and I lost them in the tall grass. I didn't have any idea that they were going to go that far when they did, in fact, at Dallas. It was some time before they found them. And the next slide. And again, the wound depicted here in this type of, in the Warren Commission, I was familiar with this kind of wound from World War II, from this kind of bullet, and it was clearly not what I expected. But when I saw the actual x-rays and photographs, it was exactly as I anticipated. A huge wound of exit, cracks in all directions. When the doctors peeled the scalp back, the skull fell apart in their hands. The fragments then diverged. Some of them went over the windshield, some of them hit the windshield, fell into the front seat, a few fell into the back seat, a few remained in the head, and that's exactly what happens when you try. And the next slide. Well, the coning that Beveling's been talking about, in case there's anybody here that doesn't know about that, when it goes in and makes a bigger hole where it comes out on the skull. And the next slide. And my friends at Aberdeen Proving Grounds that I'd worked with tried this, but they had the information that the skull had been hit down here, down low, and when they tried to reproduce the wound, it didn't come out right. It's another reason I thought there was something wrong. So after I saw the skull and found out their x-rays and the pictures and found out where the bullet really hit him, which was 4 inches higher, I said to them, why don't you repeat your experiments now that you know where he was really hit? They said, well, we're a government agency, you know, we have to be assigned a mission and then a budget, and we're busy with other things, we can't do it. Why don't you do it? So we did it. And the next slide. Well, when I mixed brains and white paint so you could see it, and when we hit the skull at exactly the right point, same point, we got exactly the same distribution of the brain tissue and the skull fragments flying up in the same way. We did this very high speed. The next slide. And these are 3 strips of movie going down, 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 and then it begins to explode here, and then you see the explosion get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the fragments go higher and higher and higher. And as I say, I was amazed at how far those fragments went, and it's not surprising to me how that it took them a while to find them. And the next slide. Well, our wounds, our skull wounds, turned out to be almost exactly like President Kennedy's skull wounds were. And as I say, this is one, we did it over and over. And the next slide. And the brain wound, as depicted in the House Committee report, showed the almost entire loss of the right cerebral hemisphere, fatal without any doubt. And the next slide. And when we hit our skulls at exactly the same point that the Zapruder movie and the x-rays and all showed, the heads exploded, more of the heavy wet brain substance went out the front, and it drove what was left of the head back, and it went back and over to the left. I'll show you a video of that if we have time. And the next slide, here doing it again. Similar thing, hitting at the right place, more of the explosion goes forward, what's left of the head goes back and to the left over where Mrs. Kennedy was sitting. Notice this cloud of brain tissue hanging in the air, and the motorcycle policemen rode into that and were covered with it, splattered with it. And of course the Connollys were splattered with chunks of brain tissue in front. The next slide. Now why does it go back? Well, this is just a diagram of what happened. And the next slide. When it goes in, we can go to the next one, John. It makes a little wound of entrance. It diverges, the fragments diverge, make a big wound of exit, and explodes, and fragments go over the windshield, hit the windshield, and so forth. The exploding brain tissue acts like it takes the easier course of exit out. The big wound of exit on the front of the head acts like a jet engine, drives the head back and to the left. And that's exactly what happened. And the next slide. The bullet, when it hits the head, surprisingly enough, in spite of its stability in wood, you hit the skull on the back of the skull, it breaks up. And the jacket and the lead core separate, plus a hail of other little fragments. And we did this over and over and had the same effect again and again. And the next slide. And I say again, you got big fragments, little fragments scattered all through the head and in front, beyond the head to the front. And the next slide. And then we did this over, and of course we know that these bullets both came out of Oswald's gun to the exclusion of all other guns because of the very specific markings on the unknown and on the cartridge or on the bullets. In the next slide. His handprint was on the gun. And the next slide, he was wearing a three-color shirt that day, and yarn fragments of all three colors were stuck on the rough wood stock of the gun. This is right out of the Warren Commission. I know some of our panelists don't think so, but it is. And the next slide, and the sound analysis where they claimed that a fourth shot was fired at this point was knocked in the head not only by other factors, by the National Research Council report, but Steve Barber, who may be here today, I hope he is. Steve is a drummer, and he, and a drummer has to listen to you talk over the clatter of his own drums. And Steve said to him, there's somebody talking in the background. Why don't you listen to that? And they did, and sure enough, somebody is saying, everybody hold everything till homicide gets to Parkland and so forth. So the president was already dead at the time of the alleged fourth shot, which was what they concluded was evidence of conspiracy. And not so. The sound evidence fell apart. And the next slide. Well, here's Oswald looking very cynical about this and very pleased. I mean, he was striving for fame. And just like John Wilkes Booth, he had two older brothers that were better at the family's occupation than he, and they were doing radical things to attract attention, and he had succeeded. Well, I see my time is either up or almost up. I have 3 one-minute videos I'd like to show you at some point. Do you want to show them now, or do you want to do that later?
If we can hold off.
Okay.
Hold off till that later.
Well, let me turn the microphone back to Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Lattimer. Dr. Lattimer, you wish to go next?
2 minutes. John, do you have my short videos, the 3 short videos? What you saw earlier, when the participants showed some of our excerpts from some of our movies of the heads being hit. And this is the exact type of ammunition that Oswald used. It's very important to have the exact kind. And the heads were struck when we knew the correct point and went backwards over to the left. And you'll see another one in a moment. And again, struck at the correct point on the head with the correct ammunition and exploded and went through what's left of it back over towards the gun. Now look at the bullet trap. These are chunks of brain tissue mixed with white paint and bullet fragments I'm pointing out. Some went over the windshield, down the street, hit the curb that somebody spoke about. Others hit the windshield, dropped into the front seat, some hit the intermediate part. And notice that what's left of the head is back and towards the left and towards the gun. Okay, can we switch over to the next short video? This one I hope is going to show you what is the new finding as of this period, namely of the time of the bullet that goes through the 2 men. Now you'll see it over and over, but you'll see the Kennedy's elbows going up, and now they come out again. His lapel now suddenly goes forward in 224, and then pops back. And we'll do it a couple more times. You'll see him come out from behind the sign. It's not hit. Now his lapel pops forward and flops back. As I say, we saw this on our clothing, but it never dawned on me to run it this slowly so that you can see it happen. Here, 223, 224, pops out, 225, and pops back. Okay, can we go on to the third video? The third video is again, courtesy of the major analysis people, projecting back from the bullet wounds in the 2 men backwards and upwards to try and reduce.
These men get entered into the animation, and what we can do then is say, well, given those wounds, where does the shooter have to be? Where is the sniper that makes the shot? We drew a straight line through the president's back wound and the governor's chest wound. What we found is, given the slight inaccuracies of wound location and heart position, that in fact the cone This says that the sniper has to be somewhere within
Okay, we're gonna cut it off, John.
Code is almost.
Well, I want to make points and reply to some of the questions. Thank you.
Roger,
John, you have those 3 slides in mind on that last carousel.
Please make them quick, John.
Yeah, make it quick. These are comments by prominent panelists. And the next slide, in which he says, all shots were fired from the rear. No support can be found for theories that postulate gunmen to the front of the right front of the presidential car. And the medical evidence indicates that the president's head was back was hit by 1 bullet, and his head was hit by only 1 other. The next slide.
Available.
Again, in another publication, the same author says essentially the same thing. There were 2 bullets only, both from the rear.
Available evidence, Dr. Lattimer, number 1. Number 2, I make no apologies and not the least bit ashamed about changing my mind as I come to learn more, as new evidence is acquired, as new experts get into it. You know what that's a sign of, Dr. Lattimer? That's a sign not only of a courageous heart and a good mind, it's also a sign of pliable cerebral arteries that have not yet become rigidly fixed with atherosclerosis.
And Dr. Weck's son got up to defend him. He did very well. Dr. Weck is a tough man to defend.
There's a final comment.
Any day you and I go on tour, sir, set that up, okay? Set up by 2030 across the country. Let's see how we do head to head, you and I.